Hello students, and welcome to the Week 12 lecture for Political Science 1513, American Federal Government. I'm your instructor, Connor Alford, and this week we are going to conclude our discussion of political intermediaries by talking about the media and the impact that the media has on politics in our country today. Towards that end, we have a series of 5 learning objectives that I want you to focus on as we move through this lecture. The first learning objective asks for you to define and distinguish between the terms media, mass media, and news media. The second learning objective asks for you to distinguish between descriptive, interpretive, and speculative reporting. The third learning objective asks for you to detail and distinguish between the main ways that the media influences public opinion and political outcomes in our country. And I'll go ahead and tell you right now, those are priming, framing, and agenda setting. The fourth learning objective asks for you to explain how persuasion is distinct from priming, framing, and agenda setting, and why it can be difficult, as well as who it actually works on. So again, the fourth learning objective wants you to explain what persuasion is, how it is distinct from other methods of media influence, why it is hard for the media to effectively use persuasion, and who is actually susceptible to it. Finally, we are going to conclude by looking at learning objective number 5, where I ask for you to describe and distinguish between prominence, breadth, and intensity as characteristics that can be used to describe a particular story being covered by the media. Let's start with that first learning objective. So the first learning objective asks for you to distinguish between the terms media, mass media, and news media. And I'm going to begin by noting that media is technically plural. The singular form of media is medium, and a medium is a channel of communication. Now, do note that in day-to-day conversational English, we have a tendency to use the term media as though it were singular or plural, and that's fine. It works for our day-to-day conversations. Just understand it is technically incorrect. Now, a medium is a channel of communication, and what that means is that it's really any tool that you use to take ideas from your head and put those ideas in other people's head. So speech is an example of a medium. It is a verbal medium. It is a channel of communication where we use verbal articulation to take ideas or information that we have and share those ideas, share that information with the people around us. But when we're talking about politics, there are some forms of media that have a bigger impact and are more relevant to our purposes here today than others. So let's narrow the scope and let's look at a particular type of media, the mass media. Mass media is a type of media. It is a channel of communication that can simultaneously reach a massive audience with the same standard message. So speech is a medium. It is a channel of communication, but it is not a mass medium. Because while speech is very useful in small groups, there are some pretty stringent limitations on the size of an audience with which you can communicate using speech alone. As an instructor, I might be able to lecture a classroom of 50, 60, 70, maybe 100 students, but if my audience gets larger than about 100 people, I'm going to start to need some technological assistance. I might need a microphone, for example. And if we get too much larger after that, maybe I'm looking at an entire stadium of people. It's not enough just to have a microphone. I need a very elaborate sound system. And if we're talking about something that's even bigger than a stadium, say a city or a state or a country, well, all the amplification in the world is going to be insufficient. Even with technological assistance, there are some pretty stringent limitations on the size of an audience with which I can communicate using speech alone. So speech is a medium. It is valuable, it is useful, but it is also limited. It is not a mass medium. When we're talking about the mass media, we're really looking at broadcast technologies, radio, internet, music. These types of mediums or media can be used to simultaneously reach very large groups of people all across the world. So Nicki Minaj, for example, can drop a new single, and for some reason, millions of people all around the globe are going to listen to that. And they can do so simultaneously because music is going to leverage broadcast technology to communicate with very, very, very large groups of people simultaneously. It is a mass medium. But music is not a news medium, and that's the next sort of subdivision in this broad category of media that we need to talk about, and it's probably the most important for our purposes. So what is a news medium? Well, a news medium is a type of mass medium, which is in turn, of course, a type of medium. And what that means is that the news media is going to be a channel of communication which routinely reaches a very large audience. But we're going to add an additional qualifier. What separates the news media from general mass media is that a news medium will regularly or routinely communicate political information about the world. Now, let's not get confused. I'm not telling you that the mass media never contains political information. As I mentioned before, mass media is a category that includes music. And we've all heard those songs that contain or have political information embedded in their lyrics. But here's the deal. Most of the time when you tune into your favorite song, you're not listening because you want to get information about the world. It's pure entertainment. Nobody listens to Nicki Minaj's song, You a Stupid Ho, because they're trying to learn. It's just mindless entertainment for some people. But when we're talking about the news media, by and large, if you tune in, you're trying to learn. You want to be educated. You want to gather information about the political universe. So Fox News or Breitbart, these are examples of conservative news outlets. This is news media. CNN, MSNBC, PBS, New York Times, all of these are types of mass media because they are going to reach very large audiences in very short periods of time. But they also routinely and regularly communicate political information. The main reason why you would tune into CNN or MSNBC, why you would read the Boston Globe, is that you want to gather political information. Now, that's not to say that there are no other factors to take into consideration. Maybe you're tuning into Fox News because I told you to for an activity. Maybe you are tuning into MSNBC for entertainment purposes. Fine. But you could get entertainment from a number of other sources. You could read a book. You could listen to You a Stupid Ho. But you have chosen specifically to tune in to a news station because that form of entertainment includes political information. And the news media is especially important for our purposes here today because it is the number one source for information about the political world around us that most Americans have. Most of us get almost all of our information about the political universe, about events and occurrences in elections and in international relations from the news. And while that might be a cause of concern for some people who don't trust the news media, it is a reality that we have to face, acknowledge, and discuss. So let's move on to our second learning objective, where we can start to talk about some of the different types of information that the media provides to the American people and to audiences around the world. The three main types of information the media provides are descriptive, interpretive, and speculative information, and they're going to do this by reporting. So we can use this fact to distinguish between three distinct types of reporting provided by journalists: descriptive reporting, speculative reporting, and interpretive reporting. Let's start by talking about the most traditional form of reporting, descriptive reporting. Descriptive reporting is a journalistic approach to the news in which reporters provide a straightforward description of the facts. In other words, descriptive reporting is when journalists simply tell us what is happening or what has already taken place. They don't editorialize. They don't share opinions about those events. They don't make predictions about the potential consequences of those events. They don't try to connect those events to other stories to create a narrative. They simply provide simple facts. So, for example, in November 2015, there were a series of terror attacks in Paris, France. That's a real excerpt from an actual news story published at around that time, which provided descriptive reporting. It provided a fairly straightforward description of the facts. They told us what happened. There were terror attacks in Paris, France. But That's it. There's no additional information there. And again, some people are all right with that. A lot of people say that this is all the media should do. It should simply describe facts and let us make sense of them on our own. Let us draw our own conclusions. But whether you like it or not, the media does not limit itself to descriptive reporting because audiences expect it to go a step further. So now we can talk about interpretive reporting. And interpretive reporting is a journalistic approach to the news, in which reporters help to contextualize and explain why an event is taking place or has occurred. So they're not simply going to tell you what happened, they're going to tell you why it happened, and they're going to help to explain how it is related to other events around the world. So, for example, if you look at the second bullet point on your slide, you're going to find an example of interpretive reporting. The media first, in the first bullet point, told us in November 2015, there were a series of terror attacks in Paris, France. That's descriptive reporting. That's describing the facts. And then in the second bullet point, it elaborates. The attack was orchestrated by ISIS in protest of Western policies towards the Middle East. So why did this attack take place? Because there's a group of people called ISIS that was not happy with the Western world's policy towards the Middle East. Now we know what motivated the attacks. And that's not all. We also understand all of a sudden that what happened in Paris, France, November 2015, was connected to an ongoing conflict in the Middle East. Because in November 2015, the United States and other countries were actively fighting against this organization called ISIS that had risen and was taking control of territory in Iraq and Syria. Well, if it weren't for the media contextualizing, helping us to interpret these events, we would have no way to understand that they are connected to one another. If the media stopped by simply saying there were attacks in Paris, France, we, the American people, would have no way to realize that those attacks were connected to events all the way across the world in the Middle East. So interpretive reporting helps us to connect separate events that seem disparate, that seem unrelated, but are actually connected. And they help us to take these events and form them into a narrative that we can use to make sense of individual occurrences. But again, the media does not simply stop here. Because once we know what happened and why, our next question has to do with why we should care. In other words, we want to know what happened, yes. We want to know why it happened and how it's connected to other events, sure. But we also want to know what it means, what consequences are likely to result from that event. And this is where we get into the third and the most controversial form of reporting, speculative reporting. Speculative reporting is a journalistic approach to the news in which reporters make predictions about the significance, relevance, and or potential consequences of an event. So if I wanted to stick to the Paris terror attacks example, I could point you to some headlines where the media predicted that because of the terror attacks in Paris, France, November 2015, the French government would go on to play a much larger role in the ongoing fight against ISIS. And that was true. That actually happened. The media predicted this, and it came true. And that's actually why I'm not going to focus on that example. Because one thing I want you to understand is that while the media does sometimes get it right, and while the media is arguably equipped with more information than the average person and therefore more qualified than most of us to make these kinds of predictions, journalists are just people. They don't have a crystal ball. And so their speculations are really just guesses. Hopefully they are educated guesses, but they're guesses all the same, and that means that they don't always come true. But remember what we've already established. We get most of our information about the world from the media, and we are going to adjust our behavior according to that information. So what we're going to discover is that when the media makes predictions, that can sometimes affect public behavior in unforeseen, unexpected, or maybe undesirable ways. If the media predicts an economic collapse, people might start to act as though the economy is going to collapse, and then the economy might actually collapse. Or if the media makes predictions about who is going to win in an election, that might actually become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Or, alternatively, it may lead to the opposite result. So, for example, in 2016, there was a story that reflected rather negatively upon Donald Trump because a recording of Donald Trump making some rather tasteless remarks about women was released in the middle of that election season. Now, I do want to be fair. You know what I'm talking about, more likely than not. Donald Trump made some vulgar comments about sexually assaulting women. Now, I do want to be clear. What he said did constitute a form of sexual assault. He was kidding. It was a joke. He laughed about it. The individual with whom he was speaking also laughed about it. So he was joking. He wasn't being serious, but he was joking about sexually assaulting women. And that's not something that people are usually going to respond to in a very positive way when it's exposed. So we have this tape, it's released, and it shows Donald Trump, then a presidential candidate, joking about sexually assaulting women. And the media made predictions about the consequences that this exposure would have for the 2016 election when everyone showed up to vote. So they said Donald Trump's recently exposed remarks about women will likely hurt his chances of winning the 2016 election or gaining female supporters. A lot of news stations went a step further, and they said that after this, Donald Trump's campaign was dead in the water. He could not win because he would not be able to get any women to vote for him. And it turns out that these predictions were incorrect. Donald Trump did not do particularly poorly among female voters. In fact, if you look at Donald Trump's performance among white women, you're going to find that he did better than Hillary Clinton, who herself was a woman and therefore expected a lot of support from other white ladies. And I think that makes sense because, of course, he's the pumpkin spice president. But pushing all of that aside, what you need to understand is that the media made a prediction, and that prediction didn't come true. But a lot of people adjusted their behavior based on the expectation that it would come true because they trusted that the media knew what it was talking about. And in this case, it turned out that they didn't. There are a lot of people who suspect that the media's prediction that Donald Trump simply could not win actually helped him to win. Because a lot of people who didn't like Donald Trump stayed home on election day thinking that whether they bothered to vote or not, he was going to lose. And then his supporters show up, they vote, and he wins. Turns out the media's predictions aren't always accurate, and that can be a problem. But we do expect the media to make these kinds of predictions. So as much as we would like to criticize the media for its speculation, understand that they provide that speculation because their audiences, we the people, expect it from them. We want to know how these events are going to affect us, and we turn to them to help us figure it out in advance. So now we know about the three major types of reporting, and we can start to talk about the three major tools that the media uses to influence public opinion and political outcomes, like who wins in an election. And as I've mentioned before, the three main tools of media influence are priming, framing, and agenda setting. So what is priming, what is framing, and what is agenda setting? Well, priming is a method of media influence in which the media affects what factors or criteria we take into consideration while forming an opinion or making a decision. And priming, incidentally, is a technique that the media uses, sure, but that we also employ in our day-to-day life. For example, if your roommate is walking out the door on their way to the grocery store and you say, hey, don't forget we need milk, you have primed your roommate to take into consideration the fact that there is no milk in your refrigerator when he or she is trying to decide what items to take off of the shelf. Now, let's be clear. Your roommate can still decide, I'm not going to buy milk. Buy your own milk. I'm lactose intolerant. I like to eat my Cheerios with beer. But if you have reminded them, if you have told them to take into consideration the fact that you need milk when they are deciding whether or not to buy milk, that makes them more likely to pick up that milk and take it to the register before they leave. So you have primed them. You have influenced their decision-making process by telling them what to think about. And the media can do the exact same thing. If, as you are going to the voting booth, the media reminds you that Hillary Clinton is under criminal investigation for mishandling emails while she was Secretary of State, and that's the fact that you are taking into consideration when you are deciding whether or not to support her, that's going to affect your vote. And it's going to affect your vote in a way that can change the outcome of the election. There is some speculation, again, that perhaps a big part of why Donald Trump won in 2016 was that right before Election Day, the media covered a story claiming that the FBI had reopened criminal investigations into Hillary Clinton, and that primed people to take that, the investigation, into consideration when deciding who to vote for. So the media affected the decision-making process by telling voters what to think about while they were deliberating, while they were deciding who to support. That's priming. But we also need to talk about framing. If priming is when the media tells you what to think about while forming an opinion or making a decision, framing is when they tell you how to think about it. Framing is a method of influence in which the media affects how we think about, understand, or interpret the actions of a political leader or an event. So, for example, if the KKK decides to have a rally, you can talk about that story in a number of different ways. You can emphasize different aspects of the story. It's the same story being covered or spun in different frames. For example, if you wanted to influence public opinion in a way that would allow for the KKK to carry out its rally, you could emphasize the free speech element. You could say, look, we don't have to agree with what they're saying. We just need to acknowledge that they have a right to say it, that people do have the freedom to express unpleasant opinions, that we do have the right of free association, and therefore they should be allowed to have this rally. In which case you have framed the event in terms of free speech. And that, again, is going to tell people how to think about this story. It's going to tell them what's at stake. This is no longer about whether you agree or disagree with the KKK. It's about whether you agree or disagree with the First Amendment freedom to express unpleasant opinions, to be an ignorant idiot, and to publicly broadcast that idiocy. Okay, great. But another way that you could frame that exact same story would be to focus on the psychological damage that a KKK rally might have on black citizens, or perhaps the economic impact. Because here's the thing, if the KKK is marching outside of your business, that's going to negatively impact your clientele. People are less likely to come in and buy a coffee if they have to march past a troop of dudes dressed like ghosts to do so. So framing is important because it tells you how to think about, interpret, or make sense of events, what aspects of a story to emphasize or focus on, and thereby it's going to influence how you respond to that story or event. Finally, we have agenda setting. And agenda setting is a little bit distinct, but basically, this is a method of influence in which the media shapes how important we perceive an event to be, and therefore how much stock we put into that event when making political decisions. So, if we can return to the example that I gave you on the previous slide about Donald Trump's remarks about women, we can find that both the right-wing media that wanted to help Donald Trump and the left-wing media that wanted to hurt Donald Trump engaged in agenda setting. So, when that story broke, if you were watching Fox News, you probably heard the language of locker room talk tossed around. Because Fox News said, look, this is just words. It was a tasteless joke. He shouldn't have told it, but come on. It's not that big of a deal. Plenty of people have told just as tasteless jokes, and there are bigger issues at stake here. We've got immigration, we've got ISIS, we've got the economy. Those are the things that are important enough that they need to be a part of the public's agenda. Those are the things we should be talking about and focusing on. And those are the factors that should shape who you vote for. You should vote not based on who made the most tasteless comment or who has the most crass sense of humor, but based on the issues, because those are important and these comments are not. They don't deserve to be a part of the agenda. On the left wing, however, we had a very different approach. They said that those comments of then presidential candidate Donald Trump were not just words. They were really important because they sent a message to our daughters. They told women about how we thought about them and how we can treat them. And the left wing told us that if you then elect this guy who's telling these kinds of jokes, you're sending a message that that's okay, that it's acceptable, that you're fine with letting somebody who talks that way represent you to the world. So we had competing agenda setting on the right and the left. The left said that this was really important, that it deserved to be a part of your decision-making process, that the comments should play a big role in shaping who you vote for or how you feel about the candidates. And the right wing said, no, it ought not be a big part of your decision. You can think about it. You've already been primed to think about it simply by the fact that the media has mentioned it, but it shouldn't play a big role. You shouldn't place a great deal of weight in that event, in that story, when you are trying to decide who to vote for. So that's priming, framing, and agenda setting. And understand that, again, these are the three main ways that the media influences how we view the world, how we feel about issues, candidates, or parties, and how we vote or act in the political arena. But they are not the only methods of media influence. There is a fourth method of media influence that we also need to talk about, and that's persuasion. Persuasion is a method of media influence in which the media attempts to influence not just what you think about while forming an opinion, but what you think, what that opinion is. So it's a direct attempt to influence your political perspectives, your political behaviors, decisions about things like who to vote for, where to stand on an issue, or which party to affiliate yourself with. And what we're going to find is that persuasion is therefore distinct from the other methods of media influence, first and foremost in that it is more direct. Because remember, priming, framing, and agenda setting all attempt to influence your decision-making process. Priming tells you what to think about while forming an opinion or trying to decide who to vote for. Framing tells you how to think about that event, story, or fact while forming the opinion or making the decision. And agenda setting tells you how much to care about that fact or event, how much stock or weight to place on a particular story when making decisions like who you are going to vote for in an election. But persuasion doesn't just tell you what to think about or how to think about it or how much to care while forming an opinion or making a decision. It tells you what opinion to have, who to vote for. It's not simply saying, hey, when you're deciding whether or not to support Hillary Clinton, take into consideration the fact that she's being investigated. It's saying, vote for Donald Trump. It's not just saying when you're deciding whether or not to vote for Donald Trump, take into consideration that he made these tasteless comments and that's a big deal. It's saying vote Hillary Clinton. And it's going to try to convince you to do so through arguments or through persuasive messages and images that are evocative or emotionally charged or potent in some other way, shape, or form. So persuasion is a method of media influence, where the media tells you not just what to think about while forming an opinion, like priming, but what your opinion ought to be. It changes what you think, not just how you think about it or how important you think the issue is. It's not just consider this, it's here's why you should agree with me on such and such issue. That's persuasion. Now, I've already told you that persuasion is a method of media influence, and I've told you that it is distinct first in that it's more direct. But it's also distinct from the three main methods of media influence in that it is less effective. I want you to understand that persuasion is the least effective method of media influence on public opinion and political outcomes. Why is persuasion less effective or more difficult for the media? Well, there are two major reasons why persuasion is so ineffective. The first is that here in the United States, we have very high informational efficiency, and we use that informational efficiency to create segmented audiences, which in turn makes it very difficult for the media to influence those people that need persuading. So let's break that down piece by piece. What is informational efficiency? Well, informational efficiency is the degree to which people can control the information we are exposed to. In other words, we have high informational efficiency when we have a great degree of control over the media content to which we are exposed. We have low informational efficiency when we don't have a great deal of control over the media content to which we are exposed. And what we're going to find is that technology has made our informational efficiency very, very high in the United States. So, for example, many of you have probably blocked somebody on your social media because they make comments or leave posts that you find offensive, racist, irritating, or simply disagreeable. When you block somebody because they're making political posts that you disagree with or find offensive, you are exercising control over the social media content to which you are exposed. You are utilizing informational efficiency. When you choose to watch Fox News instead of MSNBC because you find the content of Fox News more agreeable, you again are utilizing informational efficiency to exercise control over the media content to which you are exposed, and vice versa. If you are a liberal and you choose to listen to MSNBC because it is a liberal station, then you are again using informational efficiency. And you're using it in the same way that most people use it, to filter out information with which you disagree. What we are going to find is that people, when you give them control over the media content to which they are exposed, will tend to segment into distinct audiences. A segmented audience is an audience with very little overlap. Segmented audiences are audiences in which members are separated into smaller groups based on what information they are being exposed to. So, for example, conservatives tend to watch Fox News. If you don't know, Fox News is a conservative media outlet, and it tends to put a conservative spin on all of the stories that it covers. Since conservatives agree with those spins, since that spin reinforces their prior notions and is comforting and agreeable to them, that's the media they choose to frequently listen to or consume. They do not, generally speaking, choose to watch CNN or MSNBC because those are more left-leaning media sources. So liberals choose to watch CNN or MSNBC because they already agree with the information being presented there. Conservatives tend to watch Fox or read Breitbart because they agree with the information being presented there. Now, this makes it difficult for the media to exercise persuasion. Because if you're MSNBC and you want people to vote for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election, then you're going to have a difficulty in using persuasion to get them to do so. Since the only people who are watching MSNBC, the only people you are able to reach with your persuasive messages, are already going to vote for Hillary Clinton because they're hella liberal. If you want to persuade someone to vote for Hillary Clinton, it doesn't do you any good to preach to the choir and talk to Hillary Clinton's supporters. They're already going to vote for her. They don't need persuading. You need to reach the other side. You need to reach the people who aren't likely to support Hillary Clinton. But they're all watching Fox News, not MSNBC. So MSNBC can present the most persuasive argument in the world, and it's not going to work. Similarly, if you're Fox News and you want to convince people to vote Republican, fine, but no matter how convincing your information is, you need to get that information, you need to get those arguments and that persuasive messaging, and you need to deliver it to the audiences who are already watching MSNBC and not listening to what you have to say on Fox News. So the first reason that persuasion is ineffective as a method of media influence is that it is hard to reach the other side. And it is hard to reach the other side because high informational efficiency is used to filter out information with which we disagree, and that creates segmented audiences. The second reason that persuasion is not generally effective has to do with what we call the partisan credibility conjecture or the partisan credibility thesis. You can abbreviate this as PCC or PCT. It doesn't really matter. The partisan credibility conjecture, the partisan credibility thesis, these are synonymous terms. And basically, the PCT or PCC tells us that we don't tend to take information seriously when it comes from people that don't share our partisan affiliation or political ideology or issue preferences. The partisan credibility thesis is an empirical tendency of voters to place more trust in claims made by people who share their party affiliation, ideology, or political perspective. What this means is that Republicans trust Republicans and Democrats trust Democrats, but they distrust the other side. Conservatives dismiss any information presented by liberals as biased, and liberals dismiss any information presented by conservatives as fake news. In other words, it's easier to fool people than to convince them that they have been fooled. Once somebody's drank the conservative or the liberal Kool-Aid, they've probably become pretty set in their ways, and they're going to be suspicious of any information that challenges their biases. Now, that's probably not a good way to go about interpreting information about the world. You probably ought not filter things out just because the information is being presented by people who don't share your party ID. But that is ultimately how we tend to behave. And what this means for the media when it's trying to exercise persuasion is that even if they can reach the other side, it's not likely to do them much good because everything they say will simply be dismissed as bias. So when does persuasion work? Because I've told you it can work. It is a method of media influence. It's not the most effective, clearly. It is the most direct, sure. But when does it work? Well, the short answer to that question is that persuasion can work when the media reaches the floating voter. If the media wants to use persuasion to do things like shape the outcome of an election, it has to reach the floating voter. Well, who is the floating voter? The floating voter is a citizen who doesn't have a strong interest or strong feelings about politics. These individuals are more susceptible to persuasion because they haven't already made up their minds about where they stand. They do not, generally speaking, have a great degree of interest in politics, and because they're not usually interested in thinking about politics, they have not yet formed any strong partisan affiliation, ideological preferences, or issue positions. Since they haven't made up their mind, they are easier to influence in two ways. First, because they haven't made up their mind, they haven't decided I'm a liberal or I'm a conservative, they're not as likely to filter out information coming from the other side. You can't filter out information that challenges your political biases until you have formed political biases. Similarly, you cannot dismiss information with which you disagree as fake news if you don't have an opinion for that information to challenge. So the floating voters have not yet been fooled. They have not yet drank the Kool-Aid or become set in their ways, and what that means is that they are susceptible to influence via persuasive arguments and information. But what we're going to find is that persuasion is still ultimately ineffective, because while it can work if it reaches the floating voters are notoriously challenging to communicate with. Why? Well, if you're the news media, you need to understand that the floating voters don't have strong political opinions or partisan attachments, specifically because they don't care all that much about politics. A large number of our college-age population probably falls into this category. I'm willing to bet that a good number of you know somebody who spends a lot more time watching ESPN than they do watching the political news. And that's because they're more interested in sports than they are in politics. If you don't think about politics, then you don't form opinions because you haven't had the time to digest information about politics. And therefore, you're not going to be radically conservative or extremely liberal. You're not going to have made up your mind about whether you're pro-life or pro-choice, whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, or something else, if you have never spent time thinking about it. But at the same time, if you're not interested in politics, if you don't spend time thinking about politics, you're not all that likely to go out of your way to tune into the news media. Because remember, the news media may want to persuade you, but it's ultimately a form of mass communication that exists for the primary purpose of conveying political information. Now, they're going to try to do so in entertaining ways, but here's the deal. If you're interested in sports and not politics, it doesn't matter how sensational the political story is presented. You're not likely to choose politics over sports. So you're not likely to tune into Fox News or CNN rather than ESPN. The floating voters are hard to reach because they are not interested in politics. So when can the media reach the floating voter and therefore use persuasion to shape public opinion or political outcome? Well, the media is most likely to reach the floating voter when it is covering a story which has a great degree of prominence, a wide breadth, and a high intensity. So these three terms are all characteristics that we can use to describe or to characterize a particular story or event being covered by the media. And we're going to go through each of them one by one. Let's start with prominence. Prominence is the extent to which a story or event is treated as though it is important by the media. Remember that when the media engages in agenda setting, it's going to tell us which stories are the most important, which ones we ought to care about, and why. Well, by telling us that a story is more important, the media makes it more likely that that story is going to reach the floating voter. Because if a story seems very important to a large enough number of people, then they're going to share it with their friends on their social media or in day-to-day conversation, or simply by tuning in to the television while a floating voter happens to be in the room. If you can convince somebody that this story you're covering is a matter of life and death, they're more likely to pay attention. If you can convince somebody that the story will have sweeping ramifications for the world and for their economic position or for their family, for their life, for their happiness, if you can show them some fact or datum or piece of information that convinces them that the story matters to them on a personal level, they're more likely to tune in, they're more likely to pay attention, even if they don't usually do so. So we've all seen the commercials. It could be the most deadly thing in the universe, and you might be eating it for dinner tonight. We'll tell you tonight at 6. That's probably not true. You're not eating cyanide for dinner. But they want you to think that you are, because if you have been convinced that this is literally a matter of life and death, you are more likely to tune in to that broadcast than you otherwise would be. And once you've tuned in, then they can start to blast you with their persuasive messaging and try to shape your opinions in that way. As soon as they get you hooked, they have their opportunity to begin persuading you. Now, whether they will succeed or not, I don't know. But if you are hooked and you're a floating voter, it is more likely that they will succeed than if they are only communicating with their regular audiences. So prominence refers to the extent to which a story is treated as important. And the media can treat a story as though it's important in a number of ways. One way that a newspaper might treat a story as more important, for example, is by putting it on the front page. Where, when, and how a story is covered is going to affect the extent to which it seems to the people to be important. So prominence is when the media treats a story as though it is important. It is not whether that story is actually important. Understand, it is simply a question of whether it is treated as though it is important. And when prominence is high, a story is more likely to reach floating voters. Therefore, persuasion is more likely to be an effective mechanism of media influence. But prominence alone is not enough. You also need a wide breadth. Breadth is the extent to which a story or event is covered by a large number of distinct news outlets across a variety of different media technologies. So, for example, we would say that a story has a very narrow breadth if it is only being covered by one obscure blog on the internet. But if it's being covered by all of the blogs on the internet, plus all of the mainstream media on the internet, and the cable media, and the radio, and the print media, and it's being tossed all over the place on Facebook, Twitter, and the other social media outlets, then we're going to say it has a wide breadth because it's being covered by a lot of different outlets across many different technologies, and therefore it's more likely to reach a much larger audience. Since it's reaching a much larger audience, the statistical probability that at least one member of that audience is a floating voter increases as well. If you're only broadcasting a story on one obscure internet blog, the only people in that audience are going to be those that peruse that particular blog. That's a very small group of people. But if you're covering it across a variety of blogs and across a variety of technology and across a variety of distinct media outlets, then you're reaching the audiences of all those blogs, of all those media outlets, the audiences of the print media and of the radio and of the internet and of the cable news. And that's a much, much larger group of people. Therefore, it is much, much more likely that just by sheer chance you will happen to reach a floating voter. But finally, we need to talk about intensity. Intensity refers to the overall amount of coverage or frequency of coverage that a story or event receives from the media. So if a story is only covered once, for 5 minutes, then the only opportunity a floating voter has to stumble upon that particular story is to be flipping through the channels and to happen to tune in at that particular moment within that 5-minute segment. But if that story is covered not for 5 minutes but for 2 hours, there's a much larger window of opportunity for a floating voter to stumble upon the story by sheer chance. Similarly, if you only cover the story on Monday, then only people who are flipping through the channels on Monday are going to have an opportunity to be exposed to your persuasive messages. But if you cover it every day of the week, then your repetition, your increased frequency of coverage, means that more people are going to stumble upon the story, again, even if they normally don't seek that kind of media content out in their day-to-day life. They might stumble upon it, and therefore, again, intensity works in a very similar manner to breadth. When you have a wide breadth, your audience is larger. When you have a high intensity, your audience is larger. And when your audience is larger, it is more likely to include a floating voter. When you combine prominence, breadth, and intensity, all in very high degrees, then you have a story that is very likely to reach and capture the attention of the floating voters. And so it is when you have prominence, breadth, and intensity that persuasion becomes an effective tool of media influence. So, now we've completed each of our 5 major learning objectives, and I will see you next week.